Okay.
Let me stop sharing my screen.
Okay.
Recording in progress.
Hi, everyone. Welcome. We'll get started in just a moment.
Hi, everyone. My name is Samir Mehta, and I'm the president of SABA North America. And we're very thankful to have you here today to observe this somber occasion. As many of you know, all of you know, I'm sure, a very special meaning to all of us individually, to the country, to North America, to the world, and specifically to the South Asian legal community in a very specific way. As we'll talk about, until then, we existed in separate bar chapters. There were 8 chapters that came together at that time to form SABA North America. And the effects of it, of course, are very profound and very massive. They affected other countries. They affected people here in all kinds of ways. And so what we want to talk about is have a conversation about the way that the last 20 years have gone and where we stand today. We are very excited to have with us several members of the organization. We have 4 of the presidents of SABA North America who will be speaking in some capacity. And without further ado, I want to start by welcoming the first president of SABA North America, Navneet Chugh, who will be talking a little bit about his personal experience. Navneet?
Thank you so much, Samir. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Takes us down the memory lane. We had a lot of fun is what I would say I recall in one sentence. The journey, I think, started in Los Angeles in 1993 when we set up the Indo-American Lawyers Association in LA. And my friend Mukesh Advani set up SABA, or back then ILA, in the Bay Area. And then by 2000, about 8 cities have some form of an Indo-American Lawyers Association or SABA of some sort. So in 2000, I called up all 8 presidents of these South Asian chapters or South Asian bar associations and said, hey, let's do a national organization. And all 8 of them pretty much said to me in nicely, go to hell. And I'm like, okay. And then 9/11 happened. And then I called all 8 of them again. And this time, all 8 said, sure, as long as you do the work, we're all in favor. We were quickly able to start SABA chapters around the country. I think the milestones were that first was convincing all the 8 to adopt a common name. Seattle was called Qanun, and Chicago was called Indo-American Bar, and Georgia was called Indus Bar. It took a little while, but everybody got on board. When people find out that the train's leaving the station anyways, then everybody jumps on board. And then a milestone was when Pakistani Lawyers Association in Chicago agreed to merge with us, and as long as the name was South Asian Bar, which helped. And then one milestone was formation of South Asian Bar Association of Boston. And by then, internet had happened. By then, bar associations of states were starting to put the names and addresses of lawyers on online. So we found a list of 200 most common South Asian names, and we went through the Massachusetts bar website and picked out about 50 names. And we sent an email to all 50 saying, hey, there's 7-8 cities have a SABA. What's up with Boston? And why isn't there a Boston chapter? And those of you interested, please respond to this email. And 7 or 8 responded, and we then sent a mail to these 7-8. We didn't realize what an awesome experiment this was going to be. So all 7 or 8 that responded, we sent a mail to them saying, hey, you're now on the board of SABA Boston. And will one of you host a meeting at your office? And one poor woman, Sabita Singh, made the mistake of saying, okay, I'll host a meeting. So I responded back to her saying, okay, you hereby appointed president of SABA Boston. And she complained and this and that. But somebody once said, put good people on a bus and then don't tell them what to do and they'll figure it out. And so Sabita Singh became president of SABA Boston against her wishes, and now is a famous judge in Massachusetts. And so when this recipe worked, we pulled this stunt on many other cities and soon had a lot of SABAs around the country, including Canada. The next big thing that happened is we did the first annual conference. Of course, everybody thought there's no money in the bank account and who's going to fly to LA and who's going to come speak. But we had 400 lawyers come, 40 speakers. Governor Dukakis was our keynote speaker. And we had so much money that we didn't know what to do with towards the end. And then all these SABA chapters started fighting, oh, we should get our share. So I said, okay, before that happens, we spent all the money on alcohol and ice cream and had no net profit left. So that was the fun journey we had. The goal is very simple. There's about 4 million Indians in the US, a couple of million Pakistanis, Bangladeshis, and Sri Lankans, about 2% of the country's population. And we want 10% of the country's power. And there's 1.3 million doctors in the country. 10% are Indian or South Asian. There's 205,000 dentists in the country. Over 10% are South Asian. Same with pharmacists, same with hotels, motels. We want 10% of the 1.3 million lawyers in the country to be South Asian. We are 30,000 now, including the South Asian students in law school. So we are 100,000 behind. So that's the next generation's problem. Thank you, Samir.
Thank you very much, Navneet. And with that, I really appreciate your personal reflections on the history of the organization. We're going to shift to the panel discussion today. And this is being moderated by Sapna Khatri, who is a member of several SABA chapters out of SABA St. Louis and then SABA Chicago, and is now in Los Angeles, where she's a professor. She has a background in civil rights and will be moderating a panel of 4 different speakers to talk about several of these issues related to 9/11 and its aftermath. Sapna?
Thank you, Samir, and thank you, Navneet, for your opening remarks, and everyone for joining us today for this very special panel. Like Samir mentioned, my name is Sapna. I am currently the Sears Clinical Teaching Fellow at UCLA Law School and the Williams Institute. Just before joining the faculty here at UCLA, I was at the ACLU of Illinois, and I was first there as a staff attorney focusing on women's and reproductive rights. And then I switched over and joined as a advocacy and policy counsel focusing on privacy, technology, and surveillance issues. And now I get to work on both of those at the UCLA clinical program. So very excited to be able to, talk to you all today. But at the same time, I'm also feeling incredibly humbled to be in such esteemed company with our panelists that we have. They're going to introduce themselves, but just to quickly give you a sense of who's joining us, we have Alamdar Hamdani, who is the Assistant United States Attorney in the Public Corruption and National Security Section. We have Amol Sinha, who's an Executive Director at the ACLU of New Jersey. and Mussab Ali, who is a law student at Harvard right now, and also serves as the president of the Jersey Board of Education. So thank you to our panelists. Like I said, this is going to be a kind of an inspiring conversation, and a conversation that I feel like is really unique, and one that only SABA could create the space to have, since we're a unique set of folks. We're South Asian lawyers and law students who have been uniquely impacted by 9/11. And something that I always think is interesting is that even though each of us who are on the panel and just who joined the call today, we were in different parts of our lives when 9/11 happened 20 years ago, different ages, different locations, different cities. And still that one day impacted each of us and has left its mark on our lives, potentially shaped our careers, our personal lives in many ways. Looking back, I know I was only 8 in 2001. I was sitting in my 5th grade classroom in Columbia, Maryland, and I think I was in a math class. And I remember all of us being shuffled in by our teachers into one larger classroom. And we were asked to sit down on the ground, and we saw them roll in a TV. Now, you would think that given that day and the fact that the news was covering what was happening in New York, they were maybe going to show us what was going on, especially since Columbia is close. That's not what happened. Instead, they brought in their old school TV and started watching a movie. I think it was The Great Mouse Detective. And we're just like, we're just going to have a movie day today. Don't worry about it. And we're watching, and then I slowly saw some of my fellow classmates get plucked out and go home. And they were like, oh, my parents are here, I have to leave. Without any context for why this is happening, I wasn't really sure what was going on, but I like the movie I'm just watching, until an hour or so later, my own parents came to pick me up, and I went home. And that was when I first found out what was going on. I came home, my mom was watching the news, crying, seeing what was going on the television. My dad was on the phone frantically trying to get a hold of his brother, who lived in New York. He lived in Jackson Heights. And we were just trying to figure out what just happened. This was the first crisis that I had lived through, one of the first ones that my parents lived through since they migrated to this country. And it was terrifying and scary, but honestly, more than anything else, I just remember feeling very confused, because as an 8-year-old, I couldn't fully fathom what just happened. And for me, it didn't really click until a few days later. I'll get into that in a little bit. But first, I've shared my story and where I was that day. And I'd like to now also ask our panelists where they were on 9/11 and how they remember that day. Before we talk more about its impact, I just want to ground ourselves and get a sense of kind of where each of us were in our lives. So with that, I think it'll be easiest if we just kind of keep this in alphabetical order so that there's a flow to everything. So I'll start with you, Alamdar, and then we'll go to Amol, and then we'll end with Mussab. If you could just tell us a little bit about your background and the work you do, and then tell us where you were on 9/11 and how you remember that day specifically.
Thank you, Sapna, and thank you, Saba, Tara, and the whole gang. Thank you so much and Samir for putting this together. Sapna, I'm going to kind of take your question, kind of invert it a little bit, if you don't mind, but I will answer it, I promise. So everybody, I want to start off with a recollection of a human that appeared on this earth on September 11th, 2001. On the morning of September 11th, 2001, a young man named Muhammad Salman Hamdani made his way to work that day. He was 23 years old. And on his way to work in New York City, he found out that a plane had crashed into the World Trade Center. So Muhammad Salman Hamdani did what came naturally. He went back towards the World Trade Center because, you see, he was a medical technician, a police cadet, and he thought he could save a few lives. And he probably did, until a second plane crashed into the World Trade Center. And then Muhammad Salman Hamdani became one of the 2,700 victims and heroes of 9/11. Besides sharing the same last name as Muhammad Salman Hamdani, I, like he had been, I was raised a Muslim. I, like he was, am a South Asian. And I, like he was, am an American And just as his life tragically changed that day on 9/11, so did mine and everybody else's on this call. 9/11 shaped all of us. It especially shaped the arc of my own career. At that point in time, I was a young lawyer at a large law firm, and all I cared about was making as much money as I could. You see, I grew up poor. My daddy was a cab driver. Mom made barely minimum wage. I grew up in a 2-bedroom apartment in Euless, Texas, otherwise known as Useless, Texas. And anyway, I had a new bride and I wanted to make as much money as I could. So I was working at a large law firm. But right after 9/11, I soon realized that people who shared my culture, my parents' faith, my visage, would be looked at with eyes jaundiced by the deeds of Muslim terrorists. And so I started to do something that I thought I could do. At that point, I was the vice president of public relations or something of the South Asian Bar Association of Houston. It was a small organization. I didn't know any other South Asian lawyers. I just knew some in town. At that point in time, you got to understand, in 2001, most of the South Asian professionals, my dad was a cab driver and convenience store 7-Eleven manager. But then on the other side, it was engineers and doctors. There weren't many of us lawyers at that time. But I put together our executive committee, which was probably the entire membership. And we went to the Anti-Defamation League. So if you can imagine, at that point in time, I was a Muslim. My vice president was a Hindu, of Hindu faith, and the president was Christian, and we showed up at a Jewish organization asking for help, and we got it. And we learned about our civil rights. And through that time, we started to reach out to the community and tell folks about what it was like if you were being discriminated against and what you could do. At the same time, as Navneet talked about, I reached out. I went on the internet, which at that point in time was a dial-up internet, and I waited for it to dial up, and I found there were other South Asian bar chapters around the country. And we all reached out at that point in time. We all got together, and within a few months, the South Asian Bar Association of North America was formed. It was 8 chapters, and to this day, it is still strong. That's why we're here, I think over 25 or 26 chapters. So my career continued to change. At that point in time, a few years after 9/11, or a couple of years after 9/11, I started to represent South Asians, Muslims, and Arabs pro bono in FBI interviews. If you can imagine, after 9/11, folks are being interviewed who look like us. So I represented for free. I joined the board of the ACLU of Texas, and I would debate the U.S. Attorney's Office in Houston, where I lived, on national security issues. I debate the head of the national security section at the U.S. Attorney's Office. We talk about everything from torture to NSA wiretapping and all the issues that were popping up as a result of 9/11 and the issues that were affecting folks who look like me. And then I became the president of SABA North America in 2007. While I was becoming president, I met a man named Amol. Amol at the time was the very first South Asian to become a United States attorney in the country. First presidentially appointed U.S. attorney of South Asian descent. And see, at the same time, I had gone from representing people pro bono to actually representing individuals accused of crimes of terrorism. I also started to represent people who were stuck in indefinite detention in immigration facilities. And through that process, I got to know the U.S. Attorney's Office in Houston. And I'd realized that I kind of wanted to be on that side. Those AUSAs were decent, good professionals. And I realized that this kind of work, I wanted to be representing the United States. And so Amol said, why don't you interview with my office in Kentucky? I can tell you where Kentucky was on the map back in those days, but I found it. And I interviewed with Amol. And through luck, Amol offered me a job. And so I took it. I moved my family from Texas, my wife, my young son. My wife was 8 months pregnant when I moved her. all the way to Kentucky, just so I could become an assistant U.S. attorney and work for the Department of Justice. And that's where I've been ever since. And I've moved from Kentucky, then to Washington, D.C., where I was in the National Security Division, a division created after 9/11 in response to 9/11. And since about 2010, I've been prosecuting terrorism crimes, both domestic and international. And then I moved back to Houston, and I'm now an AUSA in the National Security and Public Corruption section, and I go after, again, terrorists, both domestic and international. As we think about over the next few days, as we talk about 9/11 and we remember what happens, if there's anything I can have you walk away from here knowing, is not me and who I am or what my story is, but know the story of somebody like Mohammed Salman Hamdani, those South Asians who died on that day, South Asians at times who were considered suspects because of the color of their skin, but were in fact heroes. Sapna, thank you so much, and I look forward to this discussion.
Thanks, Alamdar. Amol?
Well, thank you so much, Sapna, and thank you to the whole SABA crew for having me. Let me just say, Alamdar, that was just a fantastic recitation of your experience, and thank you for sharing that whole story. I will just be brief and let you know where I was on 9/11 and talk a little bit about my career path. But I was 16 years old on 9/11/2001. I was in high school, obviously. I was a junior in high school, and I remember that day very vividly. Of course, I remember the events of that day, but the memory that really sticks out to me is that evening when, after all of us were traumatized and living in suburban New Jersey, we knew families who had lost people in the towers or had people missing that day, and we were of course all grieving together and figuring out what to do, and there was a bit of chaos in the air. What I remember most vividly is that evening I went with my father to go pick up pizza at a pizza place down the street from where we lived. And I remember calling them in advance, asking if they were open, and they said, the person who picked up the phone said, "Yeah, well, we all got to eat, right?" And that's what I remembered from that moment, from that day. Like it just is something that stuck out to me. I don't have much deep meaning behind it or any philosophy behind it. It's just a memory that I have from that moment, and it's something that I carry with me when I think about what happened on 9/11. The aftermath of 9/11 is really what shaped my identity and my trajectory in a lot of ways. As somebody mentioned in the chat, there were Sikhs who were targets after 9/11. There was a lot of targeting of South Asians, as you know, after 9/11. I know the story, Alamdar, of Salman Hamdani, and I know how he was, he was defamed after 9/11, and I've met his mother on Long Island and have talked to her about her path and how she has become a champion for her son's legacy. And I too, nothing to the extent of what others have experienced, and of course, nothing to the extent of what Balbir Singh Sondhi experienced in Mesa, Arizona, where he was murdered days after 9/11. But I too experienced the gaze of people around me. I too experienced the name calling. My blood has boiled when I've witnessed my parents who were hurled insults towards them in the months and years after 9/11. These are things that carried on throughout high school, college, law school, and well into my professional career. I remember, I started thinking about a public interest career because of the aftermath of 9/11, right? I knew that I wanted to, challenge those institutions that deprive us of our most fundamental rights. I interned as a law student at ACLU National at their national security project, which, by the way, didn't exist before 9/11. And of course, ACLU's immigrants' rights docket wasn't as robust before 9/11. Its privacy, speech, and technology docket wasn't as robust before 9/11. And these are things that have shaped as a result of the aftermath and what we saw as civil liberties infringements in the aftermath. I remember when I was working at the New York Civil Liberties Union, we were representing clients who were incarcerated in a jail on Long Island and Riverhead. And I went into that jail to visit clients, and you go into the attorney visitation area. There's a vestibule that you walk through that locks on both sides. And you walk through here, the door shuts behind you. You're in a little vestibule with a guard, and the guard has to open the door on the other side to let you into the attorney visitation area. And this was day 4 or so of visiting clients for a major class action case that we were handling. And the guard in that little vestibule asked me, "So what are you guys doing here anyway?" It was me and a colleague of mine. And I explained to him, "Well, I'm with the New York Civil Liberties Union. We have a class action about conditions of confinement in this jail. And we're visiting our clients." And he said something ridiculous to me about how, that he knows that the ACLU is responsible for the terrorist act. And I was like, I don't know what that is. And I don't have, much patience to deal with, things like that. So I just said, okay, and tried to move on. But this man who was behind his uniform said to me, said to me that he thought that I looked like a terrorist in that moment. And this is me in a suit coming to visit clients as an attorney, and standing next to a white colleague of mine this guy was telling me that he thought that I looked like a terrorist. And then probably 15 seconds, that felt like an hour passed. And he then unlocks the door on the other side and says, "I'm just kidding," and lets me go through. Now, in that moment, I'm just thinking to myself, what was that? Right. And we walked through, and afterwards, my colleague asked me if I was okay after that interaction. And I was like, yeah, I wasn't too fazed by it. But what I was really concerned about is if this guy has the power or the ability or the agency to think that he can talk to me that way as an attorney coming to visit clients, how is he treating the people that are totally powerless but in his control behind those walls? And that's what sort of spurred my attention to continue public interest work. I since went on to the Innocence Project, and now I'm at the ACLU of New Jersey. But it also taught me how interconnected things are, right? Like, yes, 9/11 happened. Yes, there was a national security state that emerged as a result of what happened at 9/11. There's advances in technology that have emerged as a result of that. And there's surveillance of our communities, et cetera, et cetera. However, it's all trickled down into infiltrating local government and local municipal police departments. And it's also this rhetoric of fear and hate that has perpetuated across our society, that has allowed for neighbors to be mean to each other and bully each other and kill each other. And those are the sorts of things that I think are some of the most important concerns that we have to address. And there's a direct, maybe not as linear, but a direct trajectory between the events of 9/11, the response of our government in the aftermath, and the way we see hate crimes and violence, state-sanctioned violence, emerge today. And that's what my career has brought me so far. And I look forward to continuing the conversation. But I also am grateful for all of my colleagues on this panel and all of my SABA mentors who have been a real sounding board as I pursue my career, and folks who have allowed me to, continuing to fight the good fight wherever I can and add value wherever I can. So I'll pause there, but welcome any thoughts afterwards.
Thanks, Amol. Mussab, can you share your story?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like it's so hard to go after Amol and Alamdar. I mean, you guys are so eloquent and further along in your career, so I'll chalk it up to that. So I want to thank, again, I want to thank SABA so much for putting this panel together. And I think, when I think back to 9/11, I guess I was just 4 years old. So when I think about, my life and 9/11 and sort of its contributions to in what it's done, I mean, I've only known a world that's a post 9/11 society, right? There was never a before for me. There was just an after. And I remember my family, I mean, we immigrated here September 2000, right? So 1 year after coming to America, like, especially for my parents, I remember how vividly their lives changed. For those of you that don't know, I live in Jersey City, where, I mean, we literally have a direct view of downtown Manhattan, literally from basically all over Jersey City. And I remember looking out of my window and seeing the second tower. Sorry about that. Watching the second tower fall. Just because like we had an actual ability to see that. And, my mom, she was a teacher in New York City. And I just remember that day, she didn't come home, I think, till past midnight. And I remember just being a child and just, wondering about her safety and thinking about the sort of trauma that we had, just as, just in those 24 hours, not to mention sort of the fallout and kind of what happened after. Because I think that, 9/11 in terms of its influence in my life and its trajectory, I think Amol said it best. I mean, the way that our country responded led to a surge in hate crimes. It led to a sort of reframing of what it meant to be South Asian. And I think you can't mention 9/11, you can't mention these hate crimes without mentioning Donald Trump's presidency. I mean, specifically for me, when I think about growing up in Jersey City as a Muslim in Jersey City, I mean, in November 2015. When Trump was running, he said there were thousands and thousands of Muslims cheering on rooftops in Jersey City. I mean, something that he was called out on, and it was proven to be blatantly false. But I mean, sort of like turning the knife in our communities after all that we had suffered after 9/11, and that's ultimately what ended up leading to me running for office and getting elected here in Jersey City, was a response to sort of that national narrative about what it meant to be a Muslim, and specifically what it meant to be a Muslim in Jersey City. And so, I think when I think about, having chosen to go to law school, I think a lot of that had to do with this fact that, I've always grown up in a world where my identity and sort of people who look like me, kind of got the short end of the stick, particularly when it came to the way that the government perceived us. I mean, I remember, and I'm sure many people on this call have the same experience of like, going to the airport and kind of being taken aside by TSA. I remember flying back. Every time my father and I would fly back, we would always be taken to a separate room and questioned. And people would ask us to verify our sort of Americanness. And I just think like you reflect on those experiences and sort of the accumulation of that. And again, I think for my generation, having grown up in a world where that's all we ever knew, it's hard to even think about what life could have been like if the event never happened.
Thank you so much to everyone for sharing your stories. They are powerful. And something, Mussab, actually, you just said that really resonated with me is that for you, there was never a before, it was just the after. And I think for me, it was exactly the opposite of that, where it was like comparing the before to the after is what made me realize just how big of a deal what just happened was. And it wasn't just 9/11, it wasn't just the Twin Towers falling, it was everything that followed after. I remember when I think back on the last 20 years, I look at September 10th, 2001, and I compare it to September 12th, 2001, there was a big difference in those 2 days and the months and weeks and years to follow, because I went from being someone who never really fully realized what my race was, what it meant to be South Asian. I knew I would go home and I would eat Indian food, I'd watch Bollywood movies. But other than that, I didn't really realize the magnitude of how different I could be than many of my classmates until after 9/11, when all of a sudden I started getting berated with questions from my classmates, even teachers. People would ask if I was Muslim, if I go home and plot against America, if I'm going to go back finally to where I came from. My parents would now get stopped at airports. And this magnified when my family moved from Columbia, Maryland, we, close to Baltimore, close to DC, big cities, to Southwest Missouri, where now I'm the first South Asian ever in the city that I moved to. And so, like many of our panelists, that experience is what made me realize that, a law degree would help. I want to understand how the law protects us from this treatment, from this type of discrimination. And I know we're running a little bit behind schedule. So I'm going to dive right in to some of our questions that cover some of these legal issues, cover some of the topics that our panelists have already touched on. And we're going to discuss some of those themes, the themes of national security, of counterterrorism, of discrimination. And the first question I want to ask is dealing with probably the largest change that we saw in this nation, which is that of national security. Obviously, we saw a rise in national security efforts over the years following 9/11, something we're still seeing today. So I'm going to leave this pretty open-ended for our panelists, but broadly speaking, given that system of national security that's been developed by our governments, both local and federal, in response to 9/11, do you think Americans are safer today than they were 20 years ago? And I want to add the nuance that I'm speaking of all Americans. Do you think all Americans are actually safer today? And if you could kind of focus on whether or not you think that system of national security has had an impact on the civil liberties and rights of South Asian and Muslims in America specifically, I think that would be great to add to our discussion. So with that, Alamdar, can you share your insight?
Sure. So one of the interesting things about, and I kind of touched upon my career, right? At one point I was, debating on behalf of the ACLU of Texas, and I was, at one point I was known as a Muslim civil rights lawyer in Houston, and so I was doing a lot of civil rights and national security work and cutting my teeth on national security law stuff on my own. And then I went and I joined the Department of Justice, and through that process, especially when I joined the National Security Division in DC, I got a clearance. Right, so I have now a TS-SCI clearance. So what does that mean? That means for me as an AUSA, or for me formerly as a trial attorney in the National Security Division, I need to have this clearance to understand kind of the threats that are out there and how to deal with specific kind of terrorism issues that are popping up. I give you all of that to say I have had the benefit, or some would say the burden, of understanding the national security picture, both from the civil rights and civil liberties standpoint, and seeing it in the faces of clients and individuals who I believed whose civil rights were being infringed upon, and also on the other side where I've seen kind of, how the FBI works with other intelligence community actors, how the military works, how if there's a threat coming on, for example, how we're handling that threat as it develops, as it evolves, and how we mitigate the threat, whether it's through arrest or an interview or something else. Understanding that picture, Sapna, I would say for sure we are safer today than we were 20 years ago as a country. And that's only because of all the changes that have been made since 9/11. Whether it's, for example, one of the big reasons why 9/11 happened is because different parts of the government weren't talking to the other. FBI wasn't talking to CIA. There was this wall that was between different intelligence agencies and law enforcement. That wall has broken down. And I see that because I have access to both sides of that intelligence, and I see it. Because those walls are broken down, because the government has taken on kind of working with each other to mitigate threats, there is a really good, it's all those efforts. It's the tireless efforts of, it's creating the National Counterterrorism Center. It's creating the National Security Division. It's everything that happened as a result, whether it's DHS and the organizations that were built up in response to 9/11. How that relates to South Asians. So first of all, we all, I believe, are safer, but it's been hard, and it's taken us a lot to get here. We paid a dear price to be safer. as far as like civil rights and civil liberties in South Asians in general, I mean, I think, we're constantly have to deal with, even to this day, somebody will say to me, and just a few weeks ago, somebody said to me, I was telling somebody I was going to go somewhere, and they said, "Oh, so they can spot the terrorist." Even to this day, right? And so there is an inherent, sometimes, a view of people who look like us that we, and they think it's okay to call us those names and those words. So what I have to do as an AUSA, for example, is to make sure that whatever prejudices are out there, those are taken away from the law enforcement function. Will I always succeed? I don't know. But it's something that I think as long as there are going to be folks who look like us doing bad things overseas, we've got to be vigilant about making sure our civil rights and civil liberties are protected. It's never perfect, but I would say we're better than we were. A great example is right after 9/11, I put together a seminar, and this tells you what I knew back in the day. This is 2 weeks after 9/11. I put together a seminar and invited the FBI on civil rights, and I invited the FBI to the seminar. And here's what they said. The interesting thing is they said, if your name is Muhammad, you're going to be stopped at the airport, right? That's how it was the days after 9/11. We're not there, thank God, anymore. But still, we've got to make sure that the jaundiced eyes that look at us, if they're public actors, we've got to be vigilant about it. Hopefully that answers your question.
So can I just chime in? Yeah, thanks, Sapna. I agree with Alamdar that I think we are safer from foreign threats. I think there are institutions in place and better communication at the federal level that allows for information sharing in a way that perhaps we didn't have at that time 20 years ago. Where I think, where I think our country is not safer, or perhaps even less safe, is in everything else, right? Like we have more guns out there than we've ever had before. The threat of mass shootings is looming every single day in this country, and we see, I think, a daily mass shooting in this country in these days. The institutions that were created after 9/11, like the Department of Homeland Security and like ICE, even though there may be some aspects that are justifiable in terms of enforcement, I think they've also wreaked havoc on our country. I think the immigration system that we have in the United States right now that allows for indefinite detention of people is actually doing more harm than good. We have in New Jersey, we have hundreds of people in immigration detention on nothing more than a suspicion that they are undocumented. And that's, it should be unconscionable that we do things like that. So I think, and bias crimes and hate crimes are up, right? So the white supremacist threat that's out there is continuing to exist. And it's continuing to be emboldened. So I think, and of course we're living through a pandemic, right? And there are hundreds of thousands of people that have died as a result of this pandemic. And there is there is a link between white supremacy, the folks who are, as they call it, vaccine hesitant, and the way vaccines and mask mandates have been politicized in this country. And so, I'm not suggesting that even that has to do with 9/11 20 years ago, but it does have a thread of kind of connective tissue between the rhetoric that we saw in response to 9/11 that quickly turned jingoistic, that quickly turned white supremacist, that lashed out on our communities, and then is now failing to protect us from a disease, Right. So I think there's a combination of things that have led to a lack of safety. And I think one thing that should be mentioned is that we've all been fed a lie that a lot of people have unfortunately been convinced of, which is that we need to trade a dose of liberty in order to gain a dose of security. And that I think is easy to latch onto, but doesn't necessarily have truth to it, right? We saw post 9/11, 10 years after 9/11, we saw this report come out from the AP that the NYPD was spying on Muslim communities all across the United States, including here in New Jersey, and they were tracking Muslims in their mosques and at restaurants and going to student field trips and things like that. Years of investigation, hundreds of millions of dollars spent. It resulted in no leads. But it certainly led to a distrust of law enforcement, and it led to a distrust of the institutions that govern us. And so I think that fundamentally makes us less safe as a society when we can't trust the people that are meant to serve us.
Yeah, thanks, Amol. I'm glad I get to go after you because I was just about to touch on the NYPD spying program. But I think for the larger question, I don't think Americans are safer today than we were pre 9/11. Again, sure, I have a bias. I wasn't there pre 9/11. But I got to say, I mean, you think about the things that happened like on January 6th. I mean, despite all these agencies having the ability to talk to one another, the fact that our lawmakers in Washington, D.C., in one of our, what you would imagine our most secure buildings, we're, I mean, just doors away from massacre. I mean, like, that doesn't make me feel safe as an American. I mean, we think about the threats in terms of technology, right? I mean, like, Russia being able to hack into our elections and being able to manipulate voters. That doesn't make me feel safer as an American. When we think about the, to Amol's point, like all this tracking by the NYPD, I mean, like, my community personally was so deeply impacted by the way that law enforcement not only was spying on community members, but also just hiring community members to spy on one another. I mean, you can imagine sort of like going to a mosque and having, sitting next to someone and not being sure if that person was going to take any conversation that you had with them out of context and sort of report this to the authorities. I mean, the way that we operate as a community was so insular that, when I reflect on my experience running for office, so Jersey City is about 15% Muslim. And despite that, the reason we never had an elected official who was Muslim was because of the fact that our community felt like if we stepped into the public domain, this spotlight that existed on us was going to create this narrative where immediately you'd be looked at as a threat. You'd be looked at as someone who doesn't belong in America. You'd be, people would, sort of like call you names and sort of like lash all sorts of allegations at you. And look, I experienced that even running as someone who like basically grew up my entire life in America. I can't imagine someone who, 20, 30 years ago was also in this country and, felt that shock on a day-to-day basis. The sort of trust that our community has towards law enforcement, I don't think necessarily exists. And I don't think it's just something from South Asians. I mean, I think you look at, general American public attitudes towards law enforcement and the way that we believe the police can protect us. I mean, I urge everyone in this panel to think about the fact that when you see a police car behind you, do you feel safe or do you feel fear? And if the answer is you feel fear, well, then is the police really doing their job in terms of protecting us? Because I'll be honest, I've never felt safe when I saw a cop car. I never felt like, yes, I'm so happy there's someone here who's like, quote unquote, doing their jobs. And I think, the mechanisms that law enforcement have at their disposal too, I think is really troubling. I mean, the good thing about going to law school at this point is, we do get to reflect on some of these cases that have come through the courts that talk about this. I was thinking just recently about the case Tanvir v. Tunson, right? Like, we had 3 people who, right after 9/11 were approached by the FBI to spy in their own communities and refused to do so. Then in 2013, we're put on no-fly list. I mean, this is 12 years after 9/11, we're put on no-fly list where they could not go and visit their families. They could not go and use the airports. And for law enforcement to say, listen, we'll take you off these lists if you go ahead and agree with us to spy in your communities. I mean, like, what kind of choice is that? right? And the fact that there are law enforcement officers who are giving those sorts of choices and then, selling us this idea that that is what it takes to be secure. I mean, I think that's definitely a false sense of security and not something where I think Americans or South Asians were safer or have the same amounts of civil liberties that we should.
Thank you all for, oh, go ahead, Amol, you were gonna.
One thing I'll just add that just was triggered in my memory was, look, one of the fallouts from 9/11 was the unjust wars that were created as a result, and 20 years of war, right? That was perpetuated. But one of the consequences of that is the military surplus that existed at the federal level. That was allowed to be doled out in grants to local police departments all across the country. So now what you have is not just military equipment being used for national security, but military equipment being used for routine local law enforcement. And so you'll see armored vehicles at protests for women's rights. Right, you'll see camera systems set up throughout Black and brown communities that allow for surveillance in a way that we've never seen before, all because of grants from the federal government. So there is this trickle down effect that's also happening, that's both simultaneously making us less safe at the hands of police and also oppressing us through surveillance and other means. That is a direct consequence of the state of affairs since 9/11 and the aftermath.
Thanks, Amol, for sharing that additional insight on surveillance. That was actually one of the directions I was thinking of going, but I'm going to instead go back to something else that I think all of our panelists touched on, which is about how given this rise in national security and kind of our response, the distrust in our community and in communities of colors of the government really grew. And so I want to take that piece and link it to a conversation about immigration. Before we go into it, I want to offer some quick background about the state of immigration before 9/11. Both our local and federal governments were making efforts to build community with local communities, with the immigration system. And they were modeling this after this idea of community policing. This is something that we've heard a lot of in the last year and a half. And immigration was thinking about this. They were thinking about these ideas before 9/11, 2001, and they were exploring opportunities for law enforcement agencies and immigration organizations and minority communities to work together to improve trust and reach out to one another, because that really was the key. That bridge was the key to building a better system of immigration in this country, and that was a guiding principle. Yet after 9/11, I think we saw a massive shift almost immediately in this model, first at the federal level, and then it became more localized, just like Amol, you just mentioned, with a lot of the federal government giving grants to more local departments. So we saw the government expand its use of its immigration authority, and some will say that was to keep us safer, and in many ways it may have helped, but at the same time, it also had an impact and hurt many of our community members. So with that in mind, I want to ask each of our panelists, what role do you think past, present, and future South Asian lawyers specifically can play in the immigration context, given all of these moving parts, given the changes that we've seen in just the last 20 years? How can we be agents of change, working either within the system, with the system, or against the system, to make sure that immigration is more positive or is able to become a more robust system in this country? Alamdar, can you start?
Yeah, no, that's a great question, Sapna. So I can put it from my own personal perspective, right? So I've dealt with immigration on both sides, whether it's within the government or whether it's outside of the government. And so when I was outside the government and private sector, the way I dealt with it was and Amol touched upon these, individuals who are stuck in indefinite detention within immigration facilities. After 9/11, the way it worked is if you didn't have enough papers to go back to the country you're from, right, and the country doesn't have any good records of you, or is not giving authorities in the United States permission to have have that person come back to their country of origin. Well, the government must release that person, after six months after a final deportation order is issued. If it's not reasonably foreseeable, they're going to be removed. There's a case called Zavidas, which came out just a few months before 9/11 in June of 2001. I mentioned that case because I used that case to work on indefinite detention detainees, all of them who are Muslims, South Asians, or Arabs, who couldn't get back, for example, to Pakistan or Iraq, countries that were, at the center of the war, if you want to call it the war on terror. And so what I did as a South Asian lawyer is I took on their cases pro bono, filed habeas petitions, and it's hard work, takes a while, takes months, but you're able to get I got maybe 5 or 6 individuals released, because if it's not reasonably foreseeable you're going to be removed, you've got to be released. And then, so to answer your question on as South Asian lawyers, what can we do? I think one of the things we shouldn't be afraid of, and I didn't know anything about immigration law when I did that, we shouldn't be afraid of diving in and seeing a need and going in and taking it. These individuals who had lost money, had nobody else, and basically we're going to be stuck. Some of them were stuck in there for 4 or 5 years. Amol, I assume that's still the case out there. And so, you would know better than I would. I don't deal with habeas petitions anymore as an AUSA. On the government side, I would say this: there are not enough brown folk who look like me, right, who have my background within the USG. And whatever you think about the government, and I think it's justified to have that view, there is something of value when a brown man or a brown woman comes in and says to, for example, an FBI agent and says, well, let me give you context for why you believe that. Or goes to an ICE agent and says, or INS, whatever it's called these days, or DHS agent and says, let me give you context for why you believe that and why that may not be correct. I say that because when I joined the DOJ, I was, first of all, amazed by how many South Asians there were not. Imagine, we've only had 3 US attorneys who are South Asian, right? The guy who hired me, Amol, a woman named Rachel Pelosi, you probably haven't heard of, and then a third person who you've probably heard of, Preet Bharara from the Southern District of New York. That's it, right? Right now, the person in charge of the civil division is Vanita Gupta, and she'd been in there before. And Neil Katyal at one point was the Deputy Solicitor General. Making change, affecting change, can be done outside of the government, but also within the government. And so, to the extent that we're not recruiting, and we should be recruiting people of color, and especially South Asians, we should be. And so, a U.S. attorney or DOJ should be really looking at trying to hire more folks like that, just because when we look at national security issues, whether it's on the domestic side, or whether it's international terrorism or Mussab, or whether it's, January 6th insurrectionists wanting to commit acts of domestic terror, I think there's such a benefit of having a person of color, especially a person of our color, within government working those issues.
Yeah, I'll take it over from here. I think some things that South Asian lawyers can do is, first of all, understand the history of immigration in the United States. There's been a lot of conversations about the right way to get into this country, and there are some perceptions in the South Asian community and every immigrant community that there is a right way. However, I think there's that right way changes depending on the context that we're in. Like, it wasn't until the 1950s that it was okay for people that look like us to become naturalized citizens of the United States, because it was until then reserved for free white persons, right? And it wasn't until it was limitations on immigration were rampant until 1996, and then when things opened up a little bit, there was 1965 first for skilled labor coming from Asia, but then 1996 when things were things that changed again, and then immigration detention has been sort of skyrocketing over the past many years, including through the Obama administration into the Trump administration, and now hopefully under the Biden administration we'll see a little bit of change and a little more compassion. I think other things that we could do is, of course, there's all sorts of advocacy, right? There's immigration representation, making sure that we're representing individuals in detention and elsewhere and through their deportation proceedings. There's, of course, policy work that needs to be done at every level of government, including at the state level. It's not just a federal thing. There are state channels of funding that would allow for legal representation for people in deportation proceedings, which is really important. And there are, state efforts to make, New Jersey and every other state more fair and more welcoming and more just. So I think that's really important too. There's no barrier to entry. You should, be involved in your local community. And just on a more hearts and minds level, I think we ought to stop playing identity politics with with the different immigration identities that we all hold. I think there's a coming together that needs to happen around the immigrant story, including those who may be born in the United States, but to immigrant parents like myself, to those who came to the United States at some point in their childhood, those who came at adulthood, those who carry different sorts of visas, those who are permanent residents, those who are citizens, and yes, those who are undocumented. I think, understanding that we ought to come together to talk with one voice about why it is to have compassion around immigration generally, because it's the hardest thing in the world for anybody of any background to pick up and leave their home. It doesn't matter if you're coming here for opportunity. It doesn't matter if you're coming here from a privileged background. It doesn't matter if you're coming here under duress or because you're fleeing violence in your country. I think it's really important to understand that regardless of the circumstances, was one of the most difficult decisions that individual had to make in order to provide for a better life for their family. And I think that's one common ground that we can all galvanize around.
Yeah, I think Amol and Amdar, you guys did a great job in uncovering this. I think, there's definitely the change we can make from inside of government. I think there's the activist perspective that we can take here. And I think to Amol's point, I just want to echo one more thing that I think what South Asians should be fighting for. I think if there's one piece of legislation that I think we should be going for, I think it's the DREAM Act. When you think about the history of immigration in this country, and even particularly around immigration of undocumented people, pre 9/11, the DREAM Act was actually on pace to become legislation in this country. It wasn't until 9/11 happened that basically, any sort of immigration reform was just stopped short, right? And then, there was this huge fight to get to DACA, and then, under the former presidency, DACA was almost removed as well. And so you have people who, have grown up their entire lives in this country, know nothing other than America, but if certain legislation were to fail, would be told to go back to their country, which, again, if you spent 20 years here, what other country are you a part of? And so I think if there's one piece of legislation that I'd say that we should be advocating for and lobbying for, I think it's the DREAM Act. And I think it's possible under this administration as well.
Can I add a little bit? And first of all, I want to know one thing we haven't talked about is what Mussab did, which is to go into politics himself, even at a young age. And so I can tell you, I do not have the courage to do something like that. So I commend you, especially as a brown, much younger man than me, for doing that. But what Mussab also represents is the history of this country. And you mentioned that, Sapna. I'm an immigrant. I came in 1982 at the age of 11. I mentioned my dad was a cab driver here in America. He was also a cab driver in Manchester, England, where I was born. And then my parents immigrated to India, from India to England. A lot of our histories involve immigration across two oceans, right? My father is an immigrant twice over, my father just passed. And, one thing I think we should do is know our history. And, you know, before 1965, how many South Asians were in this country? Less than 10,000 South Asians were in this country, right? Most of the South Asians you will meet are immigrants, right? Especially of my age, they're immigrants. And so we are either the first generation or the zero generation. And so if anybody knows the immigrant experience, it's us. If anybody can speak about what it's like to be an immigrant and how to protect immigrant rights and how to advocate on behalf of immigrants and how to reform an immigration system, it's us. And so you guys both remind me of this. I just want to kind of give that little bit of history. We haven't been in this country long, but we've definitely made an impact.
And I'll just pick up on that real quick. I think the point that you made, Alamdar, about Mussab doing what he's doing is incredibly important, because they, there is this perception that persists, unfortunately, that one is enough, or that there's you get full representation when you have a figurehead or somebody like that. In New Jersey, look, we're filled with South Asians in this state. The last census, the results just came out. The Asian American numbers are huge in this state. We're over 10% of the population now in New Jersey, and the vast majority of that is South Asian. And what always strikes me is that people think that we're doing well in terms of representation because we have people, or until recently had Gurbir Grewal as our Attorney General. We have Ravi Bhalla as our mayor of a major city in New Jersey. We have Sadaf Jaffer, the first Muslim woman mayor in the country. I think all of those things are wonderful. However, who are the people that are working for those folks? Who are the people that are represented in county and local municipal bodies all across the country? Mussab, I think, is an exception, a wonderful one at that, but an exception. And we don't have enough representation across the board in our state legislature. Look, we're 10% of the population. That means that in our state legislature in New Jersey, we should have at least 12 seats. We have 3. And they are all South Asian men, and we need more diversity in our population. We need more representation at every level, and that's something I think that can't be understated because or it can't be overstated. I'm flipping that around, and I think it's incredibly important for us to advocate for full representation both in elected office and in public service, not just so that our communities are heard, because that is absolutely important, but also to demonstrate solidarity with other communities, and to make sure that we are not excluded from racial justice conversations simply because it doesn't necessarily impact us the most. One thing that I'll just share is that in New Jersey, again, this is where I live, we just got a report from our paper of record that said Asian American drivers are ticketed the most in our state. Asian Americans are ticketed the most in our state, even for violations where white folks are stopped more. Asian Americans get more tickets, and that is it was news to me, right? Like, we get more tickets than Black drivers do, than Hispanic drivers do, and of course than white drivers do. And it's not just a little bit more; it's significantly more, and it's persistent across every violation for the last 12 years. And so that. It was news to me because I always assumed that driving while Black was the problem, right? Like of being pulled over and racially profiled. However, driving while Asian certainly is as well. And our communities may experience different elements of policing. We may experience policing in different ways. However, we need to be united in addressing the injustices around policing that exist. And I think one way to do that is to make sure that we have a seat at the table, which we currently, it's a bit underwhelming in our state.
Thank you, everyone, for sharing your insight throughout the Q&A. We've had great discussion, and so I'm going to cut my questions and I'm going to throw it over to the rest of our audience that's here today. If anyone who's here, who's joined the panel, if you have any questions for our panelists, I don't see anything in the chat, but I can open it up if you are able to unmute yourself or want to chat something in that you'd like to ask our panelists. All of them, one of them, whatever.
Sapna, if you have a question already, go ahead and
Yeah.
throw that while people are getting their thoughts together.
Totally. Happy to. This is one that I have been wanting to talk to our panelists about. So someone brought up earlier today, I think Mussab, it was you brought up how we can't talk about post 9/11 without talking about what's happened the last few years, without talking about Donald Trump, without talking about the Muslim travel ban that was put in place, and without talking about January 6th. And I really want to zero in on January 6th because it was another day that I was once again afraid for a couple different reasons this time than how I may have been on 9/11. And I think some of the discussions that followed January 6th really caught me off guard and gave me pause, especially what I was seeing on social media. Obviously, we've seen a heightened suspicion of government. We've talked about this. We've talked about how folks in our community is more afraid of law enforcement, especially given some of the counter-terrorism measures that have been taken over the years. And a lot of that may be because of the use of the terms terrorist and terrorism and the way that they've been thrown around quite liberally, especially by media outlets. And again, on January 6th and the few days after, we saw a lot of media outlets, both on TV, on social media, call the January 6th insurrection, the folks that were there, terrorists, and calling the insurrection itself terrorism. Similarly, just last week, we saw a Texas ban on abortion care take effect. And again, there were folks on Twitter calling the legislators, calling SCOTUS, and anyone that was enabling that law and supportive of it as terrorists waging an act of terror against women. While both of these examples are discussing discriminatory acts that are unlawful and unconstitutional in many ways, labeling them as terrorism is counterproductive and inherently dangerous. And there's a number of reasons. We've seen civil rights advocates and attorneys, many of who are here today, warn us that using the term terrorism to describe activities that are just in ways hate crimes or discriminatory ultimately will result in negative policies that will impact people of color. And I want to hold on to that and talk about this word because the word terrorism holds a special power over America post 9/11. It became a term that is a part of American speech and a media buzzword since then. And while a big part of it has created policies that, like Alamdar mentioned, has helped maybe build a safer country, especially when it comes to foreign threat, it's also played a part in enabling policies that are enforced against people of color, namely Muslims and South Asians. So with that in mind, how has the American understanding and political discussion of terrorism impacted the civil rights and liberties of Muslims and South Asians living in America? And this time, to switch things up, I'm going to start with Mussab, go to Amol, and end with Alamdar. So Mussab, any thoughts?
Sure. So I think I agree with you, right? Like I think the word terrorist has such a particular meaning in the American vocabulary that it is very dangerous when it's thrown around. But I just kind of want to take a step back on something else that you were talking about, which is like, we talk about January 6th and we talk about those people being considered terrorists. And I want to tie that into earlier, Amol and Alamdar, you were talking about this idea of like public service and being in government. I think particularly as someone who's South Asian, who's in government, there's a lot of times where, I question like my safety because of some of the things that have happened. Particularly when you look at, this sort of white supremacist sort of actions that are being taken. Just the other day, someone sent me a link where my school board is now part of a school board watch list. I think Turning Point USA is like created this watch list, and like, it's like my name and my email that's like on here representing like radical school board members. And I think things like that, really, it gives you pause when you think about, your identity at a national level and sort of the way that people are really, coming after you. When I've talked to some people in January 6th, who were there in DC as a part of that event, there were some members of Congress who, for them, they didn't really feel like they could get picked out of a crowd, right? Like they weren't really someone that was visible as like a face of what people were going after. But I'm certain, there were many members of like the South Asian delegation who like really feared for their safety, because if they were someone who was caught in the hallway, it wouldn't matter what their name was. It was just a matter of, they were in the halls and they looked a certain way and they didn't represent what, people wanted them to look like. This group in particular wanted them to look like in the halls of power. And I think that that's something that, it's tough, right? Like we live in that culture of fear, I think, as minorities every day, where, you're not necessarily sure, the safety. And I think and I think it's just been tough, right? Just like taking that for granted sometimes in spaces that we are, when we're in places like this, right? Where you kind of feel a level of safety. You don't kind of have to like watch your back all the time. Whereas I feel like in America as a whole, it's just been a thing where you are constantly looking over your shoulder, particularly I think in positions of power.
Yeah, I'll chime in and say, yeah, I think the use of the word terrorism to describe things that are not specific is really problematic. And that's for a number of reasons. One is exactly what you said, Sapna, is that when we describe things as terrorism and produce laws and policies as a result of that definition, the people who are subject to them are usually brown and black people, and are because of the way policing works in the United States and some of the racial implications of that, we know that the folks that are most likely to be incarcerated or die or otherwise face penal consequences as a result of such definitions are people that look like us or our Black brothers and sisters. And I think that's a real problem. One other just thing that I'll add is, you mentioned the Texas abortion law. There was a lot of conversation on Twitter and elsewhere about how this is Sharia law coming to America, or these are people of my ilk, right? Like liberals that are saying things like this, or there was a lot of anti-Muslim sentiment in describing what was happening in Texas. I think that does a disservice to a couple of things. First of all, it perpetuates Islamophobia and stereotyping. But second of all, it dismisses or gives permission to the white, racist, and Christian roots of such terror, right? Like of such horrifying policies that are perpetuating harms on women and people who can get pregnant. I think that's it does us a disservice to talk about such things in such language. And so it's beyond use of the word terrorism. It's actually using things that are not feared, should not be feared, and are harmless, like religious identity, to create a perception that something is bad. And I think that stigma attaches to the people that are actually holding those identities, and it allows to scapegoat others for the actions of white supremacists and conservative lawmakers.
Hey, Sapna, that's a good question and a tough one. It's one I deal with a lot. I teach a class at U of H law called Terrorism and the Law, and I start off with a slide that says, "What is terrorism?" And I spend 2 class periods trying to figure out what is terrorism. There is this commentator said, "The search for a legal definition of terrorism in some ways resembles the quest for the Holy Grail. Periodically, eager souls set out full of purpose, energy, and self-confidence to succeed where so many others before have tried and failed." So first of all, what is terrorism, I think, is always a good question. And how we use that term, I think you're right, has to be sparingly but appropriately as well. So in my world, terrorism has a very definite meaning, at least in the words of international terrorism. There are laws in the book that talk about material support of terrorism. There's definitions, at least, that they try to place out, which deals with what is terrorism. The question then becomes, what do you call the January 6th attempted insurrection, or as you call it, an act of domestic terror, especially because there are no domestic terrorism statutes on the books per se. For example, if you notice, the individuals who are being charged, without commenting on their cases, but the individuals who are being charged for January 6th are being charged with a variety of crimes. I don't think any of them are probably called terrorism, but they're called different things, anywhere from gun crimes to conspiracy crimes. And so I think the question of what is terrorism and how should terrorism be applied is an age-old question, one that predates 9/11. But I think since 9/11 has important implications for us because when you think of terrorists, when somebody the other day says, basically alludes that I look like a terrorist, in our world, when we think of the word terrorism, my visage, yours would probably come to light. And so using that term carefully, I think, is important. In fact, I know it's important. And finally, I think, I think we've gone past the idea of the war on terror now, especially with 20 years after 9/11. And the question is, what are we in now? I don't know. What is this? Is it a law enforcement function right now dealing with trying to catch terrorists and put them away, i.e. traditional international terrorists? I don't know. And so to answer your question, first of all, I don't know what is an all-encompassing definition of terrorism. And secondly, the way that the term is used has implications, I think, for people who look like us. So hopefully that answers your question, but it's an age-old question, one that's tough to answer.
Thank you all. I'm gonna pause from the Q&A for just a moment and throw it over to Mona. Just because we're running short on time, we have a special guest who will be making some closing remarks. I want to make sure that they have enough time to address you and you get to hear from them. So Mona, I'm gonna throw it over to you.
Thank you so much, Sapna, and thank you to all of the panelists. Like Neeti said in the chat, it sometimes surprises me how emotional and raw my personal response is still to the date of 9/11. I actually had to turn off the video a few times because my reaction today, even to some of what our panelists were saying, was really raw. It's sometimes just kind of surprising, but it's such a great discussion, so thank you. But I want to introduce now Sonjui Kumar, who probably doesn't need an introduction to most of you, but she was our president from 2009 to 2010, our 7th president, correct, Sonjui? And still a, my gosh, passionate member of SABA and involved so much in SABA and has done so much. One of the founders with Navneet, and we're so grateful that she could be here today. So I'm going to pin her and allow her to make a few remarks. Thank you, Sonjui.
Thank you. Thank you, Mona, for that very, very kind introduction. This has been a tough one, to prepare for and to talk about. As you said, I was the 7th president of SABA, and I actually spoke to presidents 2, 4, and 6, Vijay Bandada, and Paul Grewal, and Inderpreet Sahni, as I was thinking about, what happened in 2001. And we have presidents 1 and 5 represented here with Navneet and Alamdar. Don't ask me anything after 7. I don't remember. I don't have those memorized, and we're missing Judge Sabita Singh in that list. But I think when we spoke about it, as we were chatting about it, what happened with SABA and 9/11 is that all of us had this desire to connect. Of course, we wanted to connect with families to make sure they're safe, connect with friends. I'm also from New Jersey, Amol. I think we all came through New Jersey at some point. There's a connection. My brother and sister worked in New York. Most of my family was in the tri-state area. So there was this immediate need to make sure everyone was safe. We had our personal experiences. My husband was stranded in St. Louis. He tried to rent a car, wasn't able to rent a car because there was still all that palpable fear about what people might be doing, even with rental cars. Inderpreet talked about how her husband, who is a turbaned Sikh, they made a decision that he wouldn't go to work that day. Vijay Bandada talked about being from New York. He was at Skadden in New York then, how they had friends. They lost close friends in the towers. And then there was just a fear all day of where people were, where were people that you knew. there was also a fear that everything had changed and that nothing would be the same ever, that the way we lived and the way we felt about our communities and each other would never be the same. And, you know, as we've talked about with national security and so many other things, it did turn out to be true. I mean, the fear was a real fear, and it has come to fruition. The next thing after friends and family, though, is we wanted to connect with others like us, with other lawyers, with South Asian community members. And that's when SABA, which was just sort of just coming into being. I know Navneet said 1993, but many of our chapters, Atlanta, you know, Georgia for sure, we had just maybe met a few times. And this gave us, you know, a focal point, a reason to talk to each other, a reason to think about what was happening to our community. And that's what we did. In New York, SABA, I think they had a call to action meeting at Skadden to talk about what sort of pro bono things people could do to help with the hate crimes that came right in the aftermath, you know, right after 9/11. I think the larger meeting was a little bit later, maybe 6 months later in 2002, but there's no question that 9/11 became a focal point around which SABA could evolve. One other thing I want to mention is that there were other bar associations that could have been there and could have spoken up, but they did not. I think at that point there was so much sort of nationalism and patriotism and the need to protect the United States and to keep it the way it was, that you know, it was hard to buck that trend. It was hard to be the bar or the lawyers that spoke up on behalf of who others in the country were fearing. So I think it took real courage and bravery on the parts of folks like Alamdar and others to, you know, really fight for the community and fight for those rights. And Alamdar, hearing you just made me remember that passionate young lawyer that I met in Santa Monica in 2004. It was amazing to be introduced to folks like you, and you know, certainly that has continued. I also want to mention that, you know, one of our own, Neil Katyal, really came to be known because of his defense of you know, Osama bin Laden's driver, Hamdan, and Hamdan versus Rumsfeld. I mean, that was his big case. And that's what sort of catapulted him into the national spotlight. And he continues to be, you know, I think probably our best known South Asian legal voice because of 9/11 and the defense of Hamdan. I still remember it was a 1-hour keynote he gave in Atlanta in our third convention. And he sort of recanted his whole experience with Hamdan and what he went through. And you had, you know, 400 people waiting for dinner, just silent and listening to his every word, because that whole memory was such a vivid one. So, and I just want to end by saying that a lot of these issues we're still grappling with as a community, as so many people have mentioned. In Atlanta, we're still reeling from the spa shootings. That was only March 16th of this year. And a lot of it, you know, was people feel a reaction to Asian American hate. It has not, you know, been deemed a hate crime by one of the jurisdictions. We're still waiting on that. But if you just think about some of the aftermath of the pandemic and the backlash against the Chinese community or anyone who looks Chinese community because of the pandemic. I mean, we still deal with all these real issues because as Asian Americans, we're always going to look the way we look. We're always going to have faiths that are different. And so a lot of things that SABA came together for on 2001 continue to be with us and part of our community. And even though this is not, you know, we wouldn't hope for this type of an incident. For us, it led to where we are today and what we've been accomplishing. So thank you so much for having me. And it was wonderful to hear from the rest of you. Thank you, Sapna.
Thank you so much, Sonjui. Thank you for joining us to share your just your story and your experience. I know that we're technically at time, but if our panelists are able to stay with us, I know we had a couple questions in the chat, so I'd love to ask those. And if I know Amol had to leave, but Alamdar and Mussab, if you are able to share your thoughts. one question that was asked said, the pullout from Afghanistan brought back all of the fears of 9/11 for me. As a Sikh man, much of my family that wears turbans, I was recalling the fear that my family and I had in seeing media pictures of the Taliban and fearing confusion. How much do y'all think things have changed since then?
Alamdar, do you want to go first?
Oh, sure. So sadly, I don't think, that kind of racism, that kind of prejudice has gone away. And in fact, I think about 4 years ago, there was, there's been recent attacks on Sikhs still to this day. And then a few years ago, even here in Texas, in Victoria, a mosque was burned down. Look, to the person who asked that question, I believe the pullout. I believe that 20 years from 9/11, that the racism hasn't gone away, and that we've still got to be vigilant about it. And there's going to be people out there, and unfortunately, what used to be the third rail many years ago is no longer, and so that's an issue that I deal with both as a father, as a brown man, but also as a prosecutor. And you see those issues arising still. So that doesn't give much comfort to the question, but I don't think I can provide much comfort on that one.
Yeah, I think maybe I'm a little bit more.
Mussab, can I interrupt you really quickly? I'm so sorry, and I really appreciate you guys going on, but I know you guys are over what we had asked you to commit to. I want to say thank you. And please, if you have the time to stay on, we're so incredibly grateful. I know Navneet had to jump off, and a lot of our guests had to jump off, but I just want to take a moment, if I don't get a chance to say this, say thank you to Alamdar, to Mussab, to Navneet, to Sonjui. Amol had to jump off, to Sapna. Thank you so much. To our guests who are here today. It really does surprise me how much it's a really raw date for many of us, not only as a South Asian, but as a human, right? It's a really, it's a date of hate, but it's a good reminder that SABA came together as a community, as of love. And what you guys talked about, the one thing that really, struck me is that we seem to still have a lot of work to do as a community. So let's get to work. Let's work together as a community and keep doing the incredible work that SABA has been doing for, really more than 20 years, as Sonjui and Navneet have been talking about. And let's continue this. But thank you so much, and thank you for staying on. For continuing to answer the questions that our guests have put on, and guests, thank you for sharing the stories that you've shared today. On behalf of SABA, we're so incredibly grateful for the discussion. It was difficult at times. It was difficult to hear at times, but thank you to all.
Mussab, you can go ahead and finish the
Recording
answer.
stopped.
Okay.
Oh, right. So I was going to say, I think I'm a little bit more optimistic on this. So I remember my mom, so she wears the hijab. She used to take the bus to school. And I remember for her,
Recording in progress.
Before 9/11, I mean, she was like a social butterfly, right? Like she would always sit next to someone on the bus, like always have conversations. She was always someone who was just like very, very outgoing. And then post 9/11, I think for 4 years, no one sat next to her on the bus for 4 years. And, she continued to wear her hijab to school. But, after 4 years, people started to sit next to her again. It's not to say racism went away, right? But I think, part of what 9/11 also did is it gave our communities an opportunity to educate Americans who wanted to learn, right? Who wanted to understand the differences. And so many of my friends who are Sikh Americans able to like explain to people what that culture looks like, what is the, what are sort of the practices, what are sort of traditions within the faith. I think even more recently, I thought about the way that, you know, communities across America respond to the Muslim ban, right? I mean, in the sense that there were so many groups that came out in force to say that Muslims were a part of the American fabric, to say that, you know, they wanted South Asians to be a part of the American fabric. And I've talked to Mayor Bala about this too, right? Ravi Bala, who's the mayor of Hoboken, New Jersey, who wears a turban very proudly. I mean, you know, his election wouldn't have been possible 15 years ago, I don't think. But, you know, today, I think it's because of the progress that we've made as a community, is the progress that we've made in terms of education and the progress we've had in sort of this opportunity, this sort of silver lining of 9/11, which I think is a good note to touch on, is just, you know, this opportunity to be in the spotlight and to represent our communities and to say, you know, this is what we're about. These are our values. And this is why we're able to contribute so much to be what it means to be an American.
And, you know, and Mussab, you make a good point. And I think one thing that has changed since 9/11, right? And I got to witness it, right? You saw the groups like the Sikh Coalition and other groups advocating for different parts of the South Asian community come together, including SABA, including SALT, and all these other organizations come together. So to really answer the question, you know, how much do you think all things have changed since then? Racism still exists. But to Mussab's point, first of all, more people want to know about that brown woman sitting on the other side of the bus wearing the hijab. But secondly, there are more tools to protect those who are victims of racism and to educate the community such that they don't become victims of racism. So, you know, 9/11 changed a lot of things for all of us. But I think what it also did is it changed the power and the voice of the civil rights community as it relates to brown folks like us. So thank you for reminding me about that, Mussab.
Thank you both. This last question, I'm going to open it up to anyone that's here, since it's a very broad and it asks for former presidents of SABA. And I know we have a couple former and current presidents, so I'd love to hear you guys chime in. How would you like to see SABA evolve in the next 20 years to continue to grow as a forum to discuss and fight for justice for the South Asian community and beyond? Free for all to anyone that's here in SABA leadership. I think it would be great to hear from you and of course from our panelists.
Well, I feel like I should probably take an initial response to that. This is Samir Mehta, the current president of SABA North America. I think that this is absolutely part of our mission. I think that one of the biggest things that we're seeing right now is that we have an amazing network of talented attorneys, and we need to figure out how to better coordinate and leverage those attorneys. And so what we've been looking at over the last several years is really enhancing our advocacy work and trying to be much more focused on what our vision is for the community. What we are looking at in the near term is having a specific agenda for policies that we want to see that address a lot of the concerns here. What do we want for representation in the judiciary? What do we want to see for representation in government in general? And what do we want to see in terms of immigration policy? Because that again is sort of the bedrock on which this community is built. And at the very least, establishing clear norms that we can live with and will be supportive of the history of this country and this community. And going forward, I think we're going to see activities that will align us with many of our sister organizations, both in the South Asian community and outside, to try to have more active pro bono work and outreach. And I think that when we connect these dots, there's great opportunity to at least meet some of the challenges here. And where that won't fall to us, I think at the very least we can connect people, including many of the ones who spoke today, to inspirations and maybe mentors who can guide them further in their careers.
Anyone else? Going once, going twice.
I can just quickly say, so, you know, I was there when the organization was formed, and maybe because I'm an idealist, I figured it's going to last 20 years. But I'm surprised to see it's last 20 years. And as somebody who, it's a volunteer organization, it's not one, all of us give up our time to put it together. Back when we started it, I wanted a South Asian federal judge, right? We wanted, South Asians within different parts of power. We now have a South Asian who's a vice president. We've got a South Asian who is on the DC Court of Appeals. 20 years from now, I want to see a South Asian on the Supreme Court. 20 years from now, I want to see SABA involved in that. And whether it's Mussab 20 years from now, whether it's, whatever it is, we as SABA, one thing we've done over the past 20 years is we haven't, as many South Asian organizations will do, and many organizations, many minority organizations do. We didn't separate, we stayed together. We've pushed through it. And 20 years from now, I want this organization to be still together. Different factions may come and go, but this organization still exists such that its voice can make sure that there's a South Asian who's a senator, there's a South Asian, who's doing those things. So anyway, I say all of that. So Supreme Court, 20 years from now, there better be at least one person on the Supreme Court, I hope. So that's what I say.
So thank you to everyone for your time today and your contributions. It's such a great discussion. So much great information. Thank you to our guests, and it's a difficult time when it's 9/11. It's hard to believe it's 20 years because the details are still so fresh for those of us that are a little bit older and remember it. But these discussions are important to remember the work that we need to continue to do, as you reminded us today. So thank you all. We really appreciate all of you being here. Thank you.
Thank you, guys.
Thanks, guys. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much.